Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're focusing on money, but maybe not in the way you usually think about it. We're not just looking at the spectacular creation of massive fortunes. We're plunging into the deep, often turbulent waters of what happens after the wealth is concentrated. You know, the immense friction, the corporate conflicts, the personal vendettas, and the high-stakes power struggles that concentrated capital inevitably generates.
Yeah, that's a really critical distinction to make. We spend so much time, celebrating the entrepreneur who builds the empire, but the real sort of enduring drama is in the process of maintaining and defending that wealth across generations through volatile markets. And this isn't just passive management, it's like a state of constant financial and political warfare. It frequently involves intense internal struggles, boardroom coups, power shifts, things that lay bare the dysfunction inside these, well, financial fortresses.
So our mission today is to unpack a stack of sources that really reveal the startling operational realities of extreme wealth. We'll examine how inherited versus, say, purely entrepreneurial fortunes function differently. We'll look at family legacies that descended into spectacular corporate chaos, analyze power plays that actually redefined entire industries, and explore the very specific, sometimes erratic ways the ultra-rich try to wield influence globally. And, well, we simply cannot talk about high-stakes corporate friction without starting right at the foundation of American industrial dynasties. Okay, let's unpack this. Think back to 1916. You've got Henry Ford, the archetype of the entrepreneurial autocrat, basically at war with his own shareholders.
Oh, absolutely. The Ford case in 1916 is pivotal. It just crystallizes that fundamental tension, doesn't it, between the founder and the investor. Ford Motor Company. Huge net profit, $16 million. And they had this staggering cash surplus, over $50 million, which was just astronomical then. Yet Henry Ford refused to issue dividends, flat out refused. He insisted on reinvesting everything into aggressive expansion. He saw the money as a tool for his future vision, not as a return mechanism for others.
And that refusal, it actually spurred legal action from his longtime business associates, the Dodge brothers, John and Horace.
That's right. They legally demanded action. They argued, quite reasonably, that profits belong to the owners, not just to the founder's grand vision. And look, this wasn't just some squabble over cash. This was one of the first major public internal battles in industrial history, really defining corporate ownership. Is the company a legacy, a mission, or is it purely a vehicle for shareholder return? The fact that one single, really determined founder could sit on $50 million and just deny his partners their share, well, it perfectly illustrates the immense personal power consolidated at the top of those early industrial fortunes.
And that Ford conflict, it's really just a micro example of a much larger economic reality, isn't it? Let's start with the sheer gravitational force of wealth over time. Our sources stress that to understand these conflicts, we have to look at the long-term view of capital accumulation, specifically dynastic capital.
Yeah, it involves looking at long histories, not just, a few decades. When you analyze countries with these deep economic histories, like France and Britain, you see patterns. Historically, their national capital stock, so the total value of all assets, has consistently equaled about 5 to 7 years of their national income. But what's really compelling, or maybe worrying, is that by 2010, the French capital-to-income ratio had actually returned to the dangerously high levels last seen just before World War I. It tells you that the great economic and military shocks of the 20th century, they only flattened inequality temporarily. The underlying dynamic pushed it right back up.
Okay, so what drives that dynamic back toward concentration? It's something that sounds a bit technical, but the implications are huge.
Yeah.
The Jobby to Jada factor?
Right, pre-G dollars. It's a deceptively simple observation, really, but it's kind of the bedrock of modern capital analysis. So $3 is the average rate of return on capital, think stocks, bonds, real estate, business holdings, that kind of thing. And $3 is the rate of economic growth, which is essentially the rate at which income from labor or, new business creation increases. When $3 is consistently greater than $8, wealth, especially inherited wealth, just accumulates faster than the economy itself grows.
So wealth generated passively, just by owning stuff, outpaces wealth generated actively through work. And you mentioned even small changes in that growth rate can dramatically shift the balance of power.
Precisely. The observation shows that even small variations in the growth rate in U dollars can significantly impact that long-term capital-to-income ratio. If the growth rate drops just slightly, let's say from 2% down to 1%, the capital-to-income ratio doubles. It goes from 6 years of national income to 12 years. What that means is, if the global economy slows down, the power and importance of inherited or existing capital just dramatically increases relative to income earned through labor.
So in real-world terms, if the economy is struggling, the person who owns the factory or the land or the stock portfolio, they command a larger piece of the pie compared to the person actually building the factory or working the land.
Absolutely. For any given distribution of wealth, this gives the owners of capital potential control over a vastly larger share of total economic resources. And history shows this concentration isn't random. That desire to perpetuate the family fortune, the dynastic motive, it's almost always been the central driving motive for wealth accumulation. It makes it less about individual achievement and more about, generational positioning.
Now, here's where we bridge that gap between the old world inheritance and modern entrepreneurship. We might think, okay, new tech fortunes, they need constant, active management to keep growing, right?
Yeah.
But the evidence, once you get past a certain threshold, it's surprisingly consistent.
Yeah, that's a surprising lesson, really. If you look at longitudinal data, like the Forbes rankings over time, you see that once a fortune surpasses a certain very high threshold, maybe $100 million, maybe $1 billion, something like that, it doesn't really matter much for its growth rate, whether it was inherited or entrepreneurial in origin. They all tend to grow at extremely high rates. The capital itself becomes this sort of self-accelerating accumulation machine. And it often keeps growing like that, whether the owner is actively involved in the business or not.
Wow. It's like hitting that critical mass just releases the capital from needing labor entirely.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving from accumulation to application, these dynasties don't just sit on their money, they use it to gain public influence. But interestingly, they choose very different strategies. Look at the Rockefellers.
Right, the Rockefeller dynasty. They focus intently on shaping the public sphere, but they do it through massive institutional philanthropy. They really treated it like a corporate strategy. John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s advisor made it explicit. He said, becoming a trustee of a large philanthropy would instantly make a man a public character. And Jr. really adopted that path. It led to this sophisticated, long-term influence.
And you can see the results of that strategy in who emerged from that orbit, right?
Indeed. It established this powerful institutional network. You see men like John Foster Dulles and Dean Rusk, for example, graduating directly from positions in the Rockefeller Foundation straight into high political office. That was a calculated, very sophisticated path to power-shaping policy, global thinking, all through perceived public service and foundation work, rather than, say, direct politics.
Okay, so contrast that strategic institutional approach with the sheer force of personality you see from someone like Andrew Carnegie, the industrial titan, in his passionate pursuit of world peace.
Oh, Carnegie's campaign was almost theatrical in how personal it was. He wasn't relying on committees or boards. He positioned himself as the peacemaker, literally. He publicly singled out Kaiser Wilhelm II, hailing him as the one man who could decide the future of war or peace in the coming century. Carnegie insisted he offered the Kaiser this comprehensive plan to make him the greatest agent known so far in human history. His approach was just entirely focused on passionate personal conviction, applied right at the highest diplomatic levels, often with, well, little regard for institutional decorum.
And that passionate conviction, it led to direct conflict even with allies. He was so driven he shuttled down to Washington to urge arbitration treaties, only to be completely alarmed when President Theodore Roosevelt signaled he wanted to substantially increase the size of the U.S. Navy.
Yeah, that confrontation really shows the limits of personalized diplomacy, doesn't it? Carnegie challenged Roosevelt directly, head on. He urged him, basically on moral grounds, to pause and reflect how the world will regard and bemoan your sudden change. He explicitly warned Roosevelt that if he went forward with the naval increase, he'd look frightened or impulsive to the world. I mean, Carnegie treated the President of the United States like some wayward business partner who needed immediate correction based on the peacemaker's own judgment. That's the kind of aggressive moral high ground only the wealthiest and, frankly, most self-assured philanthropists even attempt to occupy.
Okay, so the moment concentrated wealth meets a difference of opinion, it seems it often just devolves into explosive internal conflict. We see this shift from maybe dynastic intent to outright warfare when control is threatened. Let's look at those defining financial battles of the 1980s, specifically that famous RJR Nabisco leveraged buyout.
Ah, yes, RJR Nabisco. That story is the quintessential modern corporate coup, isn't it? Played out with just immense sums of borrowed money. It's probably worth defining the mechanism here. An LBO, leveraged buyout, it's essentially using a massive amount of debt, that's the leverage, to finance the purchase of a company's stock. The plan is usually to sell off assets or restructure the company later to pay down that debt. The RJR Nabisco fight was, well, financial warfare wrapped in a luxurious package.
And the CEO at the time, Ross Johnson, He kind of embodied that corporate luxury, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Johnson was 1980s executive excess. The corporate culture was just unbelievable extravagance. Think personal Gulfstream G3 jet for one executive, at least Rolls-Royce waiting for him in Palm Springs, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But despite all this lavish spending, Johnson really resisted the idea of outside financial control. He famously insisted he didn't just fall off the turnip truck. He wanted control, but his lifestyle kind of signaled that control was more about privilege than just performance.
But then, once the private equity firm KKR took over, that opulence just vanished, like immediately.
The shift was brutal and immediate. KKR, the new owners, they instantly sold off 7 of the 8 corporate jets. The corporate apartments went too. It was a clear signal. The era of the lavish executive fiefdom was over. But the conflict, it went way beyond the boardroom. It hit the employees hard. When KKR moved the headquarters, only about 10% of the managers who were offered jobs actually agreed to go.
They felt alienated.
Completely.
They did. Employees famously felt like they were living in an occupied land. They said things that really highlight the psychological cost of financialization, like, I don't feel like I work for a company anymore. I feel like I work for an investment. The LBO, it stripped the company not just of its debt, but of its internal identity, the loyalty of its people, its human capital, and it replaced it all with this ruthless focus on financial return for the investors.
We see similar high-stakes battles today, especially in modern tech, but the conflict often centers less on, say, financial extravagance and more on the integrity of the vision itself. Theranos gives us a perfect and deeply troubling illustration of this gap between marketing and reality. Right, Theranos. It survived an attempted board coup early on, mainly because Elizabeth Holmes maintained such firm, almost dictatorial control. The internal conflict there wasn't about lavish jets. It was rooted in the inability, or maybe the refusal, to admit that the technology simply didn't work. Holmes went to extraordinary lengths to cultivate this image of a visionary, famously wearing the black turtleneck, sipping green kale shakes all day, all in a very deliberate effort to emulate Steve Jobs.
But the reality behind that carefully constructed facade involves some really shocking technical compromises.
Yeah, the main conflict was this fatal confusion between a prototype, the Minilab device, and a finished, marketable product. When the device failed to perform as promised, the solution wasn't, fix the device, it was to circumvent it entirely. They started diluting the fingerstick samples so they could run them on conventional laboratory machines they bought from Siemens. And here's the critical breakdown. Diluting the samples lowered the concentration of analytes in the blood so much that the conventional machines couldn't measure them accurately anymore. It fundamentally compromised the results and potentially the patient's health. It was a clear choice. Prioritize maintaining the public image over scientific accuracy.
That need to maintain the founder's vision, or sometimes recover it, brings us back to Apple. The initial ousting of Steve Jobs was a classic boardroom coup, wasn't it? But his return was arguably an even more dramatic reversal of power.
Absolutely. When Jobs was initially forced out, the CEO who replaced him, John Sculley, seemed to fundamentally misunderstand Apple's core value proposition. Sculley dismissed Jobs' vision of Apple as a wonderful consumer products company. He actually labeled it a lunatic plan. Sculley argued, quite famously, that high-tech could not be designed and sold as a consumer product. That rejection of the founder's DNA really defined Apple for years until, well, their financial position became pretty dire.
And how was the return managed? It sounds less like a structured rehiring and more like a necessary emergency intervention.
Oh, it was messy and deeply political. Jobs' eventual return involved a crucial board decision and the dismissal of the then CEO, Gil Amelio. But the sources reveal that even as the board made this move, Jobs himself was apparently not yet forthcoming about the exact active role he would play. It seems the board just knew the company needed its founder back, almost regardless of the job title. His presence alone was probably seen as enough to initiate the change needed and stabilize the vision.
Okay, finally in this section, let's look at the Redstone saga. That felt less like a swift coup and more like a grinding, decades-long dynastic civil war fought out in public and in the courts.
The battle between Sumner Redstone and his daughter Shori over succession and competency at Viacom and CBS, it was just a textbook example of how inherited wealth can poison familial relationships. The internal strife was apparently so pervasive that employees reportedly joked about giving each other subpoenas for Christmas. Sumner, who was a famously stubborn patriarch, publicly humiliated Shori. He stated flatly he had no intention of naming her CEO. He even claimed his wife at the time was closer to me these days than my daughter. Just brutal.
So Shori was initially sidelined, dismissed even. But she didn't just give up or walk away.
No, and this is the crucial nuance you often see in these dynastic conflicts. Shara was granted concessions, things like full ownership of a $190 million Russian theater chain, a $5 million venture fund, assets that were probably meant to keep her busy, keep her elsewhere. But she eventually used her retained power as her father's direct heir and controlling shareholder to stage a far more drastic course. Unquote. She methodically removed the executives who opposed her vision. It really proves that in dynastic warfare, if you can maintain control over the core ownership mechanisms, even if you're on the periphery for a while, you can eventually stage the decisive power play and take back the kingdom.
Moving on, when wealth reaches these extreme levels, it doesn't just enable eccentricities, does it? It often isolates the autocrat entirely, creating a management structure focused solely on managing the erratic demands of the leader. Howard Hughes is maybe the definitive historical case of this.
Oh, Hughes's isolation created absolute corporate paralysis. His aides, for instance, had spent 2 years pursuing the complex acquisition of Los Angeles Airways. They'd even secured major financial guarantees from Hughes's own companies. Everything was set. But then Hughes, operating from his extreme isolation, just reads the press announcement. And he unilaterally explodes, claims he hadn't approved the deal, orders it killed immediately. His control was absolute, regardless of the financial costs or the years of work wasted.
The desperation of his aides trying to manage the logistical impossibility of his life while billions were at stake is just astonishing.
Their urgency was driven by critical business needs, real deadlines. At one point, they were urging him to meet the governor of Nevada in London to resolve an issue that was threatening to liquidate all his Nevada holdings. They warned him there can be no further delays. And just to underscore the sheer complexity of dealing with Hughes's physical isolation, they included this deeply telling personal detail in their memos. They noted that his barber was literally standing by to trim his beard and clip his toenails before he would even consider returning home. Think about that. A multi-million-dollar corporate crisis was entirely dependent on a successful grooming session for a recluse who refused to see anyone. It's madness.
Okay, shifting from eccentricity to something far more calculated and sinister. Extreme wealth can enable reckless behavior by creating an environment where accountability is just severely diminished. We have to look at the patterns described around Jeffrey Epstein.
Yes, the accounts suggest Epstein's behavior wasn't random. It reflected a calculated methodology rooted in socioeconomic exploitation. The sources state he specifically sought out economically disadvantaged underage girls. The perception, according to the plan described, was that they would be less likely to complain to authorities, or perhaps lacked a credibility to be believed if allegations were ever made.
And the environments he created seem almost designed to establish immediate total control and a complete lack of boundaries.
Yes, the physical setting itself appeared engineered to reinforce that power imbalance and lack of boundaries. Reports mention girls being brought upstairs where photographs of nude women lined the stairway hall. Furthermore, accounts described them often meeting Epstein when he was wearing only a towel, normalizing vulnerability and a lack of privacy right from the start. The money provided the insulation to apparently execute this deliberate methodology for years.
The exposure that comes with being extremely wealthy, even for public figures trying very hard to control their image, it generates immense scrutiny. It can lead to this feeling of total violation.
Absolutely. Consider Oprah Winfrey. She was described during her early empire building as surfing on high waves of spending, but she felt totally violated after pictures of her bathroom, a deeply private space, were sold to a tabloid by a subordinate. Her reaction was immediate. She fired her creative director, even though he hadn't personally published the photos. Why? Because she maintained this absolute expectation that those images should have been locked in a safe. It shows that for the truly wealthy, the threat often comes from the inside, from the staff trusted to maintain their personal world.
We see a similar, though maybe more volatile, reaction to perceived threats from figures in modern tech who often operate with extreme self-assuredness, perhaps.
Well, look at Elon Musk, who famously tends to view the world in pretty binary terms. You're a hero or a bozo, it's success or failure. He was pushed to the extreme, apparently, by a perceived physical threat to his then 2-year-old son, X, involving a stalker in December 2022. Musk reacted by taking the highly public step of posting video footage of the incident online, on X, formerly Twitter. This move, driven clearly by self-preservation, immediately escalated what would typically be a private security matter into a very public, very high-stakes confrontation. It reflects perhaps the lack of filter and the immediate reaction time afforded by controlling such powerful communication platforms.
Okay, now let's pivot to a different kind of financial self-defense happening on Wall Street. A conflict not really between individuals, but between old institutional money and disruptive new technology, specifically the rise of high-frequency trading, or HFT.
Right, the rise of HFT fundamentally fractured market trust. It caught major institutional investors and hedge funds completely off guard. Traders at SAC Capital, for instance, which was already famous and soon to be infamous, were suddenly seeing the market move away from them the instant they tried to execute large orders. They didn't realize it at first, but they were unknowingly walking straight into HFT traps designed to front-run their trades.
And the mechanism that fueled this was known as co-location, right?
Thank God.
That became a major point of contention and outrage among big investors.
Oh, massively. It was the ultimate insider play. We should probably clearly define co-location. It was the practice where high-frequency trading firms paid the exchanges huge sums to put their computer servers in the exact same building as the exchange's own matching engine. This gave them an absolutely absurd speed advantage. They received market data milliseconds before everyone else, and those milliseconds were more than enough time to trade against the incoming orders from traditional institutional investors, basically picking them off.
So the outrage wasn't just about being beaten in the market. It was about feeling fundamentally betrayed by the system itself.
Exactly. Ronan, one of the founders of IEX, the exchange set up to counter this, described Wall Street during this period as an industry of bullshit. The anger among major investors wasn't just aimed at the HFT firms themselves. It was also directed at the major Wall Street houses, the brokers who were supposed to be handling their orders and protecting their interests. They were outraged that these houses failed to protect them from this new predator, and underneath it all, there was this pervasive insecurity. Many major investors were apparently unwilling to admit their own ignorance about what co-location actually was, which just allowed the secrecy and the advantage to persist for longer than it should have.
Let's expand our scope now. Look at how extreme wealth translates into direct global political and military leverage. We have to start with the notorious figure Victor Bout, often called the Merchant of Death.
Yeah, Bout's power was unique. It wasn't just derived from capital in the usual sense, it came from operational dominance, a very specific kind of logistical control. He was deemed such a dominant figure in global conflict zones because he had established this unique monopoly over the air transport that moved the bulk of the arms streaming into Africa. He was effectively fueling conflicts across the continent simply by providing reliable, deniable logistics that almost no one else could match or, importantly, evade.
And his ability to evade international regulatory control, it sounds like it required immense dedicated complexity, like a full-time job just staying hidden.
Oh, it was a bureaucratic nightmare for regulators. Bout practiced constant aircraft re-registration. It was like a shell game that allowed him to operate with near impunity. He'd use the same core cargo plane, say an old Soviet Il-76, and he'd sequentially register it in countries like Liberia, then maybe Swaziland, then the Central African Republic. The very same plane might sometimes fly with a registration from the Republic of Congo. It made it nearly impossible for global regulators and sanctions regimes to pin down ownership or halt his operations.
And what were intelligence officials most focused on regarding his shipments? Was it just the conventional arms?
Well, intelligence officials fixated heavily on allegations that his planes were used to move chemical poisons, things like cyanide and ricin, potentially for groups like Al-Qaeda. However, the sources we looked at note that despite the intense scrutiny and the severity of those charges, the CIA apparently never received credible reports of actual WMD weapons of mass destruction material being shipped on his planes. The focus often seemed to be on the most sensational allegations, even as his real, undeniable power lay in the logistical mastery of conventional arms transport on a massive scale.
Shifting focus geographically in Asia, we see wealth translating into influence through the formation of these tight political cartels, designed specifically to protect what one source called economic rents. We should probably unpack that term a bit.
Right. Economic rent here basically refers to unearned income. Income derived from owning or controlling a resource or a market position, rather than through genuine innovation or productivity. It's profit you gain simply because competition is prevented or limited. And we see this clearly with someone like Lok Yu, a powerful Chinese tycoon in Malaya back at the turn of the century. His influence was built almost entirely on political transaction.
How did that transaction work exactly? It sounds complex.
It was. Lo Q was deeply entrenched locally. He worked closely with Chinese secret societies. He even provisioned rival mining gangs with food and weapons just to maintain order and influence within that sphere. But simultaneously, he went to great lengths to ingratiate himself with the British colonial administration. He adopted English manners, befriended the British resident general, a real balancing act.
That dual loyalty, or maybe dual strategy, seems like a masterful balancing act. What was the economic payoff for him?
Immense. Because he was deemed so important to state business, mainly for controlling the large Chinese labor population, the state administration granted him unprecedented tax reductions and mining incentives. His wealth was built not just on business success, but heavily on state-sanctioned protection from competition and preferential taxation. Pure economic rent, in many ways.
And we see this kind of cartel behavior almost institutionalized in places like Hong Kong, according to the sources.
Absolutely. In Hong Kong, the Chinese tycoon's primary political goal for decades was maintaining a heavily cartelized domestic economy which provided generous economic rents. It was the whole game. For example, the Hong Kong Bank was protected for years by a government moratorium on new bank licenses and an interest rate cartel agreed upon by the major banks. This cartel system essentially presided over what was called an orderly and highly profitable transfer of economic control from British to Chinese companies.
Which means, despite all the rhetoric you sometimes hear about Hong Kong as a free market bastion, the reality on the ground, especially domestically, was precisely the opposite for a long time.
Exactly. It was largely a managed economy designed for the benefit of the entrenched elite. The richest businessmen were rich because of those cartels and monopolies. These arrangements forced the general working population to pay artificially high prices for basic necessities, things like food, electricity, gas, real estate, while the fabulously wealthy often took their income in largely tax-free dividends. The system was engineered, quite deliberately it seems, to concentrate wealth by protecting established profits from open competition.
Okay, moving back to the U.S. context, political leverage can also be wielded very effectively to fight against systemic change, particularly things like environmental regulation.
Yes, Charles Koch, for instance, explicitly used his early donor summits as a direct extension of his company's corporate lobbying efforts. The focus wasn't just on general conservative politics. It was often on drumming up support for specific environmental fights, particularly opposing government action on climate change that would directly hurt the fossil fuel profits of Koch Industries and others in that sphere. After the Obama election in 2009, the sources say the urgency and, frankly, the widespread fear among the conservative business elite were so great that the conference was just swarmed. It really transformed into a major hub of coordinated political resistance aimed squarely at defending existing economic interests against regulatory threats.
This relentless, almost singular focus on maximizing financial metrics brings us to the figure of Jack Welch at GE, who became, for many, the embodiment of the shareholder primacy dogma.
Welch's philosophy was remarkably clear, almost stark, an endless quest to enrich his investors. That seemed to be above all other metrics: employee loyalty, community engagement, even long-term industrial health. His relentless focus on downsizing, constant deal-making, and financialization ultimately led to the wholesale dismantling of GE's original industrial pillars, the things GE was famous for.
And the final consequence of that dismantling provides a really powerful, if maybe tragic, industrial irony, doesn't it?
It really does. Welch sold off the plastics division, the appliances business, the lighting business, all these core components of GE's identity for decades. The tragic irony highlighted in the source is that years later, you had American workers making products that still had the GE logo affixed to them, but they were working for a Chinese company, Haier, which bought the appliance division. And often, they were earning less than they had when the factory was actually owned by GE. He prioritized that short-term shareholder value so absolutely that some argue he functionally broke a key part of American industrial capitalism, demonstrating that the pursuit of maximum shareholder return can sometimes be mutually exclusive with industrial longevity and the stability of, well, human capital.
So, digging through all this, what does it all mean? We've traced these narratives across centuries, across industries, from the early days of Henry Ford fighting the Dodge brothers over dividends, right up to the high-tech conflicts of co-location on Wall Street. The pattern seems to hold true. Whether the fortune is old or new, concentrated wealth is inherently volatile. Yes, it might generate spectacular innovation sometimes, but it inevitably generates deep, sometimes really destructive conflict. And this often results in either a highly personal vendetta or a swift corporate coup.
Yeah, what really stands out when you synthesize these stories is how often these critical conflicts are rooted fundamentally in resistance to necessary change. Think about it. You had Henry Ford resisting the fundamental change of distributing dividends. You had Sumner Redstone resisting the unavoidable change of succession. You had the traditional financial world struggling desperately to adjust to the disruptive change brought by HFT technology. It seems the greatest battle these financial empires face is rarely external competition, or rather the internal forces of ego, inheritance, and the constant struggle for absolute, often quite erratic, control.
So this deep dive really reveals that the biggest threats to these financial kingdoms almost always seem to be waiting for them right inside the gates, maybe armed with a lawyer or a subpoena rather than a sword.
Exactly. And if we connect this conflict back to the bigger global picture for just a final thought, consider the ultimate challenge of regulating wealth that operates so seamlessly across borders today. The political solution to controlling this globalized patrimonial capitalism of the 21st century, as Piketty calls it, may actually require something far larger than the nation state as we know it. It might necessitate forms of regional political integration, maybe something like the European Union model, but perhaps even broader, to effectively implement necessary measures. Things like a progressive global tax on capital. That's a concept that remains entirely beyond the current legislative reach of any single country acting alone. It really forces us to ask if our current largely 20th century political structures are even capable of containing the 21st century economic forces we've unleashed. Something to think about.